Almost there. Just give me a second while YouTube does its connections.
It says we're live, Rabbi.
Yep, but that I had to double check on the YouTube side, and it's good. Okay, so with that in place, let's get down to work. All right. So I hope that everybody is doing well. A reminder that we are in Mishnah Keritot, chapter 1, and we will begin tonight with Mishnah number 3. So last time, as we saw in Keritot, we talked about certain transgressions that were punishable by karet, and that if it was done intentionally, and if it was done unwillingly, then there was a special offering that was brought because of the mistake. However, if you weren't sure whether you had done it at all, then you might bring an asham talui, a suspended offering, an offering that was a just-in-case scenario. So now we are going to continue with a different set of offerings, and it may seem a little odd, but let me give you the bit of background that we need. So hopefully you have read through the section of Torah known as Tazria, and in that parasha, it talks about an offering that is brought after a woman has given birth. It is a special offering that's done for the postpartum, if you will. So this is going to be talking about some difficult cases. The basic outline of what is being brought is very clear in the Torah itself. We don't need to rehash it. We'll review a little bit more on one of the later Mishnayot, just as is needed. But the short information that we need to know is that for a birth, the sacrifice has to be brought. But what counts as a birth? That's what we're going to end up focusing much of tonight's discussion, meaning that if there is a miscarriage, then under what circumstances does the miscarriage qualify for the sacrifice, and under what circumstances does it not? So let's go ahead and get the broad outline on the page, and then we will look at some specific cases with more detail. Okay. There are some women who bring a sin offering of a woman after childbirth, and the offering is eaten by the priests. And there are some women who bring a sin offering, but it is not eaten. And there are some women who do not bring a sin offering at all. All right, so we have three categories: those that bring and it is eaten, those who bring but it is not eaten, and those who don't bring. And we are going to see the Mishnah discuss each of those categories in turn. This Mishnah, however, elaborates: the following women bring a sin offering and it is eaten by the priests. So this is you might say the standard category. Obviously, a normal birth in the normal way, everybody agrees, you bring the offering and it is eaten. But we're going to deal with the exceptional. Like we've seen many times, it's the exceptional that often is in need of additional explanation. One who miscarries a fetus with a form similar to a domesticated animal, one who miscarries a fetus with a form similar to an undomesticated animal, meaning a wild animal, or one who miscarries a fetus with a form similar to a bird. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir is basically arguing that even in these cases where the fetus that has been miscarried, but which still obviously exits the woman's body, even where it has a shape that is wildly different from the shape of a human baby, that we still offer up the sacrifice. And the rabbis say, meaning the majority of the sages, she does not bring a sin offering unless the fetus has the form of a person. And with regards to the woman who miscarries a fetus that is the shape of a sandal, that is to say, it is the form of a flat fish, or if she miscarries the placenta, or an amniotic sac in which the tissue developed, or a fetus that emerged cut in pieces. And likewise, a Canaanite maidservant owned by a Jew who miscarried. In all these cases, she brings a sin offering and it is eaten by the priests. So the rabbis have a slightly different standard. It's not the shape of animals. It has to have the shape of a person, or to be in one of these other unusual but still recognizable and common conditions. Now, the rabbis are treating this very clinically, much as if you were in medical school trying to analyze this. This does not mean that a miscarriage would be treated clinically and without emotion or empathy within the community. Of course, the community would care about what had happened. But in addition to caring, we have to also be able to rule on whether a sacrifice was necessary, and if necessary, whether it was eaten or not. So what the rabbis are saying here is that in their conditions, the form of a person, the sandal, the placenta, the amniotic sac, in any of those cases, if that is what is miscarried, if that is all that is seen that comes out from the woman following the end of the pregnancy, then you go ahead and offer, and that is considered to be normal enough to meet the minimum requirement of a birth, that it requires the sacrifice, and that sacrifice, because it meets that minimum requirement, can be eaten by the priests. So there isn't as much doubt in these cases. Okay, Aaron, yes, question.
Hey, just out of curiosity, does this, since it's a childbirth, does this Mishnah reflect the importance of a fetus at all, or no?
So I was expecting that someone would raise that topic. And the short answer is no, it does not. So you could try to make some arguments that based upon the different descriptions of the shape of the fetus, that a fetus that had reached that shape within the mother would somehow have a different status vis-a-vis abortion, which is where everybody wants to find rulings because it is the darling topic of American politics. And everyone seems to think that they're going to find a magic bullet to solve this question. But the rabbis have made it very clear in numerous other places that even up to the very last moment of birth, before the child has taken a breath, if abortion is the correct thing to do, then it's the correct thing to do. The shape, the size, the trimester, the whatever is immaterial. Until the child emerges and has taken a breath, if abortion is the appropriate decision, then it is still allowed under all of those circumstances. This is merely talking about what counts as a birth in the case of a miscarriage, which has a sacrificial issue attached to it. Like we've talked about before, but for those who haven't watched earlier lessons, Judaism does not satisfy either of the American political extremes with regards to abortion. For those who want a biblical prohibition on all forms of abortion, I'm afraid Judaism doesn't give you that biblical prohibition. In fact, Judaism says quite clearly in many places that you are required to abort in the case where the mother's life is in danger. On the other side of the spectrum, where people want to say that an abortion should be done regardless of the issues, and if it is just what you feel like doing, it's perfectly fine. Judaism likewise says, unless there is a serious issue, then abortion should not be done. And for those who would like a very clear black and white description of what counts as a serious issue, there isn't one. That is handled by the rabbi and the family and the doctor in consultation with each other. And thus it cannot be reduced to a simple pamphlet. And different communities, of course, will have different customs and traditions of what does and does not count under different circumstances. So yes, Judaism does not reduce this hot button issue to a simple bumper sticker, much to the chagrin of others. And for those who wish to try and turn Judaism into a bumper sticker, well, my condolences. You are really doing a disservice to our faith, which demands the careful consideration of the particulars of each person and each situation. So that's my short speech on the topic of abortion. But this particular topic, the issue here regarding the shape of the fetus and in the case of a miscarriage, doesn't give us any information on abortion per se.
Right. But Rabbi,
Yes.
I had a quick question. Because my understanding, and I think we went over this last time, the ruling on the fetus is it constitutes life, it constitutes important life, but it does not constitute human life, which is why if the mother's life is in danger, you can always do an abortion up until the head and half the body is outside the womb, because human life takes precedent over almost everything else.
I mean, that's a reasonable broad definition. But like you said, even whether you describe it as life or not life is really still playing into the American definition of this argument. And no one denies that there is life in a biological sense. But those who talk about the life of the fetus are not arguing about biology. They're arguing really about a spiritual equivalency. And thus using that language without a great many caveats and a lot of conversation is really something that is likely to be grabbed by a particular form of the American political spectrum.
Right.
So instead, simply to say that abortion is permitted, which doesn't mean that we discount the importance of the fetus, but it does mean that we prioritize the health of the mother, and the definition of health is not something that can be reduced to a simple piece of legislation. That's why, in general, even though Judaism does say that abortion should not be used in casual or frivolous manner, it is in general better to allow more freedom for abortion, in order that in Judaism we are able to carry out Jewish law, which, like I said, at some times does demand that we abort in order that the mother's life be saved. And I would shudder to think if our legislation prevented us from fulfilling that religious dictate. Jose, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yes, Rabbi, I have a question. In Psalms 139, how we handle this declaration that said, "My embryo saw your eyes," that is only like a poetic?
Yes, poetic is exactly right. The other way to handle it is much like I was discussing during our Lunch and Learn, where we were talking about a voice declaring which embryo would marry which embryo, is that it's talking about those that will come to term, those that will grow up, those that will live, are the ones that are being referred to. If a child that has been conceived will not be carried to full term, for example, in the case of a miscarriage, or in the case of an abortion or other tragedy, the poetry still works, but clearly it doesn't apply to that one, meaning that God doesn't declare that that embryo is going to grow up and marry someone. To go back to my Lunch and Learn class, which was quoting from a teaching in Masechet Sota from the Talmud, God doesn't make that declaration for a fetus that is either doomed to be miscarried or to die in infancy from an illness, but only for those that will eventually marry. And that is known by the Holy One, even if it's not known to us, of who will live to maturity and be able to get married. Aaron, your hand's up again, yes?
Yes, Rabbi. Then why does it distinguish between, we'll say, the status of the fetus or how developed it is? Because I take it this stuff is not just procedural, there is actually some substance behind this. Or am I wrong? Is it just procedural?
No, it's partially procedural, partially substantial, in the sense that the rabbis did consider that there needed to be something discernible within the miscarriage, within the aborted tissue, in order for there to be the actual declaration that this was a birth. And if it wasn't found, but merely the other discharges were found, then the requirement to bring a sacrifice and the other strictures that involve purification would not be implemented. So yes, the actual shape and form was considered to be important, but it was important not because of the status vis-a-vis the abortion arguments in America, but because of Torah's discussion of what counts as having been born or not born in the case of a miscarriage. There's a beautiful section in Brachot in the Talmud where it talks about David HaMelech, about King David. And unlike the non-Jewish kings that would just lie in bed all day and live a life of luxury and indolence, David would actually roll up his sleeves and feel into the discharges of women who had miscarried to see whether or not there was any discernible form within it, in order to be able to make a ruling on what the proper response was for them. And although that sounds, of course, very messy and very hands-on, it's told in the Talmud to his credit to say that this is how passionate he was about making sure his people were following Torah.
But Rabbi, if it's just to determine whether or not it counts as a birth or not a birth, that seems to be like a procedural distinction without giving meaning to it. I think doesn't this section have, it's been a while, doesn't it have 3 different kinds of fetuses it talks about?
Well, we have some more. Yeah, we've got 2 more Mishnayot that are dealing with this topic. So yes, we have a number of different types that are going to be covered over the next couple Mishnahs.
Yeah, and just not to get ahead of ourselves, is there a reason though it distinguishes between the separate 3 from a substantive point of view and not just a procedural point?
So maybe I'm misunderstanding your definition of and difference between substantive and procedural.
So my definition of substantive is what is the reason why we distinguish between the 3, where procedural is just, this is, you distinguish between the 3, and the substance is the reason for the distinguishment. Well,
the reason is because we might be able to argue in the modern world, where we have different biological and technological tools to help us answer these questions, but our ancestors were left with a very vague issue. Somebody would miscarry. The tissues that would be expelled from the woman's body would be subject to interpretation. And whether or not it actually had begun to develop, or whether it had not, whether it was merely a collection of the lining of the womb, or whether there actually had been an embryonic implant, was not something that was easy for them to discern. And the rabbis wanted to be sure that a sacrifice was only being brought in the case where it was meeting that minimum definition of having developed to the point of being born, or bornable, I guess you might say. So I consider that to be very substantive, because the rabbis did not want there to be a sacrifice that was done inappropriately for the wrong reason. If it had just been a non-birthing type of discharge, then bringing a sacrifice would be, in fact, a transgression. So they had to make a distinction. And that's why they are distinguishing between those that are clear, that we see in this Mishnah, those that are probably but not clear enough, which we see in the next Mishnah, and those which are definitely not enough, and which we see in the following one after that.
Yeah, but then isn't a sacrifice just more of a procedural thing, unless it attaches more importance to the fetuses that deserve a sacrifice versus the fetuses that don't deserve a sacrifice?
A knife to the chest. A sacrifice is never just a procedural thing.
Right.
The sacrifice was always a very powerful and important spiritual act that was only allowed under the right circumstances. A person could not just sacrifice however and whenever they felt like it. For example, if a person had never sinned, if such a person existed, they would never be able to bring a sin offering. If a person never had a child, they would never be able to bring this offering, even if they wanted to, even if they said, well, I know I haven't, but I want to treat it metaphorically. The altar is not a metaphor. The altar was something that was only for the appropriate moments in order to guide us spiritually at those moments. So the rabbis were not going to be cavalier about allowing or disallowing without being very careful about drawing lines of which category merited which response.
Right. And that's actually kind of a rhetorical question. Sorry about that.
Okay.
But I meant, what was the substantive change that made the fetus at this point in time warrant a sacrifice?
So like I said, it's whether or not you can identify very clearly that indeed a fetus had begun to develop beyond the mere water stage, as described in other parts of rabbinic literature. That there is a preliminary stage where the pregnancy is treated as though it were just water, that nothing discernible to the naked eye is found within the discharge. And they want to make sure that the case where it can be discerned, that what you're discerning actually is a miscarriage and not some other cluster of tissue, which is entirely possible, and especially with very poor health, nutrition, and circumstances, bodies can do very unusual things. And the rabbis dealt with many more aberrant bodily functions and many more aberrant pregnancies than are found in our modern society.
So at that point, would more value be attached to it than before that point, or no?
I don't know what your definition of value would be.
Like
valued by whom and for what?
It becomes more important or less important?
For what?
For how much meaning we give to the life form. Even though it's not quite human life, it takes on more meaningful life. So,
I mean, the first moment you recognize that you and your partner are having a baby is of infinite meaning, regardless of what comes down the line. And the loss of that pregnancy has infinite meaning to the couple that lose it. It doesn't gain more meaning the further it goes on, or less meaning as it goes on. As far as legal value or worth, no, it doesn't shift at those points either. Natan, you've been very patient with your hand up. And you're muted. There we go.
Yeah, I don't want to, I don't think that I deserve the definition of passion, but yes, I was waiting. I have also, okay, if we are asking questions, I have 3 questions. I'm already tell you. The first one is, okay, I try to read again, and it's not clear the connection for what the sages say. They say, unless it has something of human form, that's what you consider abortion, correct? So you need to bring a korban. But what is the second line? She who aborts a son or a amniotic sac or a fashioned shell or a fetus that come out in a segment. So what happened that those are not deserving a korban?
No, those do receive a korban.
Also.
Right. So what they are trying to describe in those exceptional cases, right? So we have a hierarchy of clarity, right? An actual baby that's born, right? 9 months, baby comes out, boom. Obviously, you need to bring the sacrifice. A miscarriage happens, but what is miscarried obviously has the form of a person, meaning that it is far enough along in the development that with the naked eye, you can clearly see that this was developing into a person. Boom! Again, very clear. A korban, a sacrifice, is required. The next ones are places where you might have thought, no, but in these cases where the miscarriage resembles a sandal, meaning it's flat, almost like a flat fish. And also if there is the placenta or the amniotic sac with tissue that's developed, or if the fetus emerges in pieces, then we can still assume, even if it's not obvious that there's the form of a person, that there would have been the form of a person if that is what has been expelled from the body. And therefore we can, on that presumption, still offer a sacrifice and go ahead and eat the sacrifice with a full knowledge that yes, these things only happen if there actually was the development of a full pregnancy. So that's why these are listed here. These are all signs of a full pregnancy that has gone awry, that has had a problem occur, but they are all considered to be definitive signs of an actual pregnancy rather than some other issue.
But pregnancy, but not pregnancy in late period, like not like the 9th or 8th month, because the fetus or the amniotic sac or the placenta could be also before.
Right, it could be, but if the placenta comes and the baby doesn't, then there's a huge medical problem, because without the placenta, the baby can no longer live inside the womb.
Mhm.
This is more a question of, you see the placenta, but you don't see the baby, right? You see the placenta, but you don't see the miscarriage, the actual form of the child. But that means that the placenta formed around the child, and the sight of the placenta is enough to know that there was an actual pregnancy developing. And so with just the evidence of the placenta, the korban, the sacrifice, would still be brought.
Okay. The next one, when you talk about, one second. So all are proof of pregnancy, clear proof of pregnancy.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, likewise, the idea of the flat miscarriage, the idea would be that somehow the embryo got crushed within the tissue bundle, the material, that you know still counts as what would have been a normal pregnancy had this not miscarried.
Now, when you, in the next sentence, say talk about slave woman, are Jewish slave woman, correct?
No, it's actually talking about a Canaanite.
So why they care about bringing a sacrifice to a different god?
No.
And they don't believe in that.
Well, it's not their choice, right? So the sacrifice that's brought on behalf of the maidservant that was Canaanite is teaching us that within the Jewish community, if you had a non-Jewish slave who was pregnant and had a child, or who miscarried, that there would still need to be a sacrifice on behalf of that child that was born, because it is part of the household.
So we have the responsibility.
Correct.
And the owner of the house will pay for it.
Well, in this case, yes, the Canaanites would not have had any assets of their own. They couldn't have done it themselves.
Huh. That's very interesting, because very according to the parasha of the week. Actually, yes. And the last one, don't kill me, but I received the book on Thursday.
Right.
No, yes, on Thursday, the day after. And when I was reading, there's something that wasn't clear, and probably will take you 2 seconds, more than my question, introduction.
I can hope.
Yeah, the first Mishnah, when say the 34 things that, no, more the 36.
36, yes, for Karet.
Correct. One, you say one who compounds the anointing oil or the incense. What does it mean, compounds the anointing oil or the incense?
Oh, so that's Old English, right? That's Old English from like being a pharmacist. It means to mix together to make it.
So to dilute the quality of the oil or the incense?
No. It's you take the raw ingredients and you mix them together in the right proportion, and now you have the official incense or oil for the temple or for other uses. So if you make it and you're not supposed to be the one making it, or you're making it for the wrong reason, then you have earned karet.
So it's use wrong ingredients or using for a wrong reason?
No, it's using the right ingredients for the wrong reason. So I'll give you, there's a wonderful section of the Talmud, I can't remember which Masechet, I apologize, where it talks about the family that was in charge of the incense and the other families in charge of the oil, the anointing, that they never used anointing oil for themselves, not even other formulas, because they didn't want people to suspect that they were misusing the oil for the actual anointing. So yes, using the oil incorrectly or mixing the oil, if you're not the one who is supposed to be doing it, you're using the right ingredients, the right formula, that is punishable by karet.
or mixing the incorrect person. The person that's not supposed to mix is missing.
Right. So if I found the long lost formula for the incense or the oil, because we don't actually have those formulas, there's a whole nother story about how we lost that information. But if I found the long lost formula and I got the ingredients and I took my mortar and pestle and I mixed it together, I would be guilty of a sin, punishable by karet. I can't just make that and put it on display in a museum or something. I can put the formula on display and, let people know, although it was a generally guarded secret, which is kind of why we lost it. But I couldn't actually make it because I do not have the authority to make this.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, and I see there's a question. The Avtinas family. Thank you. Thank you, Jose. So yes, that's one of those issues of, copyright. How much do you allow one family to monopolize the formula to protect it so it's not used incorrectly? But then what do you risk if that family disappears or is wiped out and they were the only ones with the knowledge? It's a very much a double-edged sword because you can end up with problems in both directions. All right, Mishnah number 4. We're moving on to our second category from the list of 3 categories in Mishnah 3. And these women bring sin offerings, but their sin offerings are not eaten. All right, so this is the category where we know that there should be an offering, but we're not 100% sure if we're doing it right, and therefore we bring it, but we don't eat it. One who miscarries and does not know the nature of what she miscarried. So, for example, a woman has a miscarriage, but she cannot either produce the material or identify what it looked like when talking to the Kohanim. And so the Kohanim know that she miscarried. They know she was pregnant. She was sure she was pregnant, and they know she's not pregnant now, but they don't know exactly what she lost, where in the development and such. So because we can think that she might have been pregnant enough, we go ahead and we make her do the offering, but because it might not have been sufficient, the offering itself is not eaten. Aaron.
Are they adjudicating off one witness then?
Of course, in this case, they have no other information to go off of.
All right.
And 2 women who miscarried, and a case where one miscarried a fetus of a type for which a woman is exempt from bringing an offering, which is what we're going to see in Mishnah 5, and the other one miscarried a fetus of a type for which a woman is liable to bring an offering, which we saw in Mishnah number 3, and they don't know which miscarried which type. All right, so the 2 women are both there, and they say we both had miscarriages, and one of us miscarried like this, and one of us miscarried like that, and one of them is from the category that we saw in Mishnah 3, and one of them is from the category we will see in Mishnah 5, then we know that there was at least one of them that needed to have an offering. And so we offer on behalf of that one miscarriage, but we don't eat it because we can't identify for whom it actually belongs. Now, Rabbi Yossi gives a very important clarification on that. He says, when is their sin offering not eaten? It is when both women went to different places within the temple to bring their offerings. That is to say, this woman went to the east and that woman went to the west. But if both of them were standing together, both of them together bring one sin offering and it is eaten. So meaning if you cannot talk to both of them to try and clarify who had which and which had one, then yes, you bring one, but you don't eat it. On the other hand, if they're both standing next to each other, and you can investigate and clarify which had one and which had the other, then only one offering is brought because only one offering is needed, and that offering can be eaten. So he's saying if there's a way to resolve the doubt, if there's a way to talk to both of them and work out who actually had which case, then of course we're able to do this. But if they are on completely different sides, and there's no way to identify which is which and identify the women who are bringing the issue, then you are left in the case of doing one offering and not eating it. Yes, Aaron.
Does this Mishnah assume that the two women left and that because who eats it? The priest is the one who eats these offerings or no?
Yes, the priest is the one that would eat the offering.
So does this Mishnah assume that the woman had left and that's why they can't figure out which is which?
Or simply that they can't identify which was which from the crowd. She said, my friend and I, we both had a miscarriage, and one of them looked like A and one of them looked like B. And they say, well, wait a minute, where's your friend? And they say, oh, well, she went to the Kohen at the other gate. And they're like, well, where is she? And they can't find them. Then in cases like that, then you end up with only having one offering and it is eaten.
But
and it is not eaten, excuse me.
Isn't that an extremely unlikely situation that two girls would have a child at the same time and not be able to identify which one is theirs? So I thought that the commentary.
Wait. So hold on, Aaron. You were there all the way through Yevamot. Are you only now surprised by unlikely circumstances? Because in Yevamot, we had people who didn't know who they had married. We had people who didn't know which baby belonged to whom. The Mishnah gets into very unlikely and very hypothetical situations. And then it's nice when it or the Talmud walks us back into more normal behavior. But the hypotheticals, yes, can be quite wild. And that sometimes makes us suspect that it never actually occurred and that the rabbis are merely trying to make a legal point. But it could be, and I don't know. I've never heard of anything derived from this particular case, but it could be like the case of the weasel that is moving a fetus from one womb to another of cows, and the issue that leads us to understand in vitro fertilization in the modern world. So I don't scoff at extreme examples that are very unlikely, because there may be some moment where this is absolutely essential for us to know. But yes, I agree with you. I doubt this was an everyday occurrence. If it was an any day occurrence, I don't even know.
But was there a commentary that cleared up that it might have been if the two girls left and it was left to the priest to figure out which is which? In that situation, it would make it not such an obscene not such a remote possibility. It'd just be, since they left, the priest would now be on their own to decipher this without any testimony. Right.
Theoretically, that could also happen, where the priests are left with the issue, and they can tell that one is of type A and one is of type C, and they're not sure which belong to whom. And then yes, they would offer up a sacrifice, but not attached, not be able to eat it, because it could not be attached with definitively to one of them.
And that would be like a less remote hypothetical, right?
It depends on how well you think the priests are doing their job.
Oh.
Natan?
Yes, and when we are talking about it is eaten or it's not eaten, are we talk about the Kohanim and Levim, or are we talking about the family that bring the sacrifice?
The Kohen.
So when you say the Kohen is not eating, meaning they only just leave this to born, and that only God will eat it and no one else.
Essentially, yes, exactly.
Why?
Because it can be established definitively that a sacrifice is needed, but it cannot be established definitively that it should be eaten, right? Because there is enough of a doubt in the issue here, using the term both ways, that it probably needs a sacrifice, but we're not so clear that it should be eaten. And since the eating is an additional statement of certainty that it was brought for the right reason at the right place, then it has to have that additional clarity. But it can be just offered and then allowed to burn, at which point it is taken care of and we're okay. So this is the compromise in this unusual in-between status. And then in Mishnah 5, we're going to see cases where not only is it not eaten, but you don't have to bring anything either. No sacrifice at all. So let's take a look at Mishnah 5, and maybe the contrast will help clear that up. Mishnah 5. Excuse me. These women do not bring a sin offering, meaning nothing at all. A woman who miscarries an amniotic sac full of water, meaning there's no tissue development at all, or one full of blood, or one full of different colors. And likewise, a woman who miscarries a fetus with a form similar to fish or grasshoppers or repugnant creatures, meaning other creepy crawlies or creeping animals, and a woman who miscarries on the 40th day of her pregnancy, and a woman who gives birth by cesarean section. Rabbi Shimon deems a woman liable to bring a sin offering in the case where she gives birth to a by cesarean section. So all of these are cases that are of undeveloped or improperly developed fetuses, and therefore, if it is of those forms or that type, then it has not reached the minimum threshold to be considered a birth when the miscarriage takes place. And that's an important distinction to understand here for when we get to the second part of this Mishnah, which is the sacrifice is here because of the birth. The sacrifice is here because a miscarriage is still considered a birth. Now, it is, in modern parlance, what we would call a stillbirth, but it is still considered a birth. It's only a question of whether it qualified enough in its development to count as a birth. And these particular criteria, before the 40th day, if they have this different, more almost insect form, or if they are, if it's just amniotic fluid or liquid, then it is not sufficient to be counted as a birth when it exits the woman's body.
But
Now,
cesarean is a full section, is a full birth.
Okay, so that is why we bring up the second section. Now, Rabbi Shimon says, wait a minute. Cesarean is birth, right? I mean, if a child is born by C-section, that counts as born. And you know, both of my kids were, so they're in the other room. They were definitely born. And you know, I wouldn't tell my wife that she didn't give birth to them just because it was C-section. That would probably get me a smack. But what the rabbis argue, at least according to the argument in the Talmud on this with Rabbi Shimon, is they say the section that brings this issue uses the very specific language tazria. And tazria means that there is seed involved. And I'll try and put this as delicately as I can because the Talmud's a little bit more blunt. For the birth to count for this sacrifice, not necessarily for other things, but for this sacrifice, the birth has to occur using the same plumbing as the seed used when it first came in. Meaning that the unique usage of the word tazria, meaning the seed that was used to impregnate, that had a particular avenue of entry. Right? It did not enter the woman through the side of her stomach. It entered in the more usual way, if you will. Therefore, this sacrifice is only triggered when the child or the other material leaves by that same passageway. So that's why the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Shimon on this particular point regarding the necessity of bringing a sacrifice. But like you can see, Rabbi Shimon definitely is speaking logically that if we're only talking birth, then it shouldn't matter which way the material leaves the body. But the rabbis are arguing it's not just about birth, it's about fulfilling the specific criteria of the Torah, which went out of its way to use the term tazria when introducing this topic.
And Rabbi Shimon lost?
Rabbi Shimon loses, yes. Jose, I see your hand.
Yes, Rabbi, you mentioned something about the cesarea, and I was reading something that the ceremony of the Pidyon Haben, they don't allow that the person who was born by, the cesarea.
That's right.
Performs this. So why they don't allow that, and suddenly in this other matter, it's totally different?
No, actually, in this matter, it's the same.
Okay.
Rabbi Shimon is a single opinion, and he says a C-section counts as regular birth, and you'd need to bring a sacrifice. The other rabbis, the general voice of the Mishnah, says no. that a C-section would not trigger the need for this sacrifice. And the language I would use with Pidyon Haben is that a C-section likewise does not trigger the need for the Pidyon Haben. It's not about being disallowed. It's about not triggering that particular requirement. And Judaism, as we've been discussing through much of this section tonight, has a very clear idea of some things are not just allowed or disallowed, some things are required or forbidden. And in the case of bringing an incorrect sacrifice or having an incorrect mitzvah and especially the blessings that go with it, if it is not required, then it is disallowed. If it's not optional, it's not, well, I still like the ceremony, it's so pretty, I want to do it anyway. No, you don't get to choose to do the Pidyon Haben or this sacrifice just because you feel like it, because that is misunderstanding the nature of obligation. Obligation doesn't start you on one level, and then if you feel like it, you can do a whole bunch more too. You can do more in some circumstances, but many things that we are not required to do, we are not allowed to do. And making sure we know the difference is a big part of how letting Judaism actually guide our life rather than merely give us suggestions for our feelings.
So, Rabbi, if I understood correctly, his question, your answer, if your wife had an cesarean,
right?
You are not allowed to do a Pidyon Haben.
Correct. Right.
And what about Brit Milah? Because if you start in this way, you can continue all the way.
No, Brit Milah is still required regardless of how the child comes out, right? And that's specifically with regards to the Pidyon Haben. Let's go ahead and I'll give you a bit more detail on that. The Pidyon Haben talks specifically about the rechem, about opening the womb. And so the rabbis take it as a very specific criteria that in order for the child to be required to have Pidyon Haben, first of all, it has to be a ben, it has to be a boy. And second of all, it has to literally open the womb, meaning it has to open the birth process and leave in the normal form, meaning through the normal birth canal, past the cervix, literally opening that part of the womb. And with a C-section, the child does not open that part of the womb because it leaves by the side door. Now, the child is still born, which is why, of course, it still needs Brit Milah, it still needs circumcision, but Pidyon Haben is not triggered because that child did not open literally the womb, which is the language that the Torah uses for the requirement of redemption of the firstborn. Does that make a little more sense?
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Aaron.
Yes, Robert. How come they emphasize for purposes of this sacrifice the way the child, or even in certain circumstances, fetus, becomes so important and not so much that a child is born?
Well, because, we're talking here about, in all of these cases, Mishnahs 4, 5, and 6, 3, 4, 5, we're talking about miscarriages. In the case where the child is born, meaning we've actually got a kid, then there's not much of an argument except about the C-section like we just discussed. But what they are arguing about is whether or not the fetus had reached a level that when it left the body, it can be considered a birth. And the argument in Mishnah 5 is that these categories, the amniotic sac, etc., did not reach that threshold of causing a birth to occur. And since no birth occurred, no sacrifice is required on behalf of the birth. It was... I know that's different than how we talk about it in modern English, right? In modern English, a miscarriage in the 3rd week and in the 12th week and then, the very end, God forbid, wherever it happens, we use the term miscarry for all of those categories. But what this is trying to tell us is that there are miscarriages that count as a birth, for the purposes of the sacrifice, and there are miscarriages that do not count as a birth for the purposes of the sacrifice.
Right,
And-
but
Go ahead.
or actually, I mean, the main question was on the opening of the womb. Why is that so important that it warrants a sacrifice versus just the
No. Sorry. The opening of the womb is talking about the redemption of the firstborn, pidyon haben,
right?
not this topic. So yes, there's a lot of different rules about birth. There is this particular sacrifice. There is the issue of redeeming the firstborn. There is the issue of Brit Milah. All of those are very important, and each have their own details that are subtly sometimes woven from the language the Torah itself uses. So why is it important with regards to the redemption of a firstborn to have it open the womb? Because the Torah uses that language. Likewise, why is it important that there not be a C-section for this sacrifice? Well, because the Torah uses the language of seed, at least according to the argument of the rabbis, that makes a functional difference. We can argue with that logic, but that is the logic of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, and that's the logic that eventually becomes the halacha.
Right, but Rabbi, my understanding was it's just because the Torah said so is never. There's usually more to it than just that, because the Torah doesn't just say stuff for no reason. There's meaning behind it.
Absolutely.
So I just wonder, we had the rabbis talk about what was the meaning behind having the opening of the room required for a sacrifice.
Well, again, I think we're still crossing wires a little bit. The womb opening with regards to, you mean in this particular case, we're not talking about pidyon haben. We're talking only about this now?
Yeah, I actually got a little confused between the firstborn but my understanding is what you're talking about. It has to, even a miscarriage has to. Well, the miscarriage there'd be no C-section in miscarriage. So.
Right, but the miscarriage topic, the topic of Keritot here in these three Mishnayot. Actually, we're going to get a little bit more in the next two, but that's for next week, I think. The miscarriage topic is not talking about opening the womb. The miscarriage topic, with regards to the C-section distinction, is referred to by the rabbis to be referencing to the tazria, to the path of the seed with which started the pregnancy, and that the baby has to follow that same path outward.
Yeah. Why is that so important, though?
Well, it's important because, first of all, the Torah chose to use that language. But I'm not entirely sure why it would be considered better or somehow more significant or less significant if the Torah had not made that distinction. I guess it's the so important phrasing that I'm trying to get behind exactly where your question is rooted and headed.
Well, I mean, why does the Torah make this procedural distinction? Well, I shouldn't say, take the word procedural back. Why does the Torah make the distinction that between leaving the womb and having the C-section?
So we'll back up just one more level. So the rabbis, at least, are usually not busy in the Mishnah asking the question of why. Sometimes they do, and it can be very interesting when they have those arguments. But more often than not in the Mishnah, the rabbis are trying to argue, how do we fulfill the Torah? How do we actually follow the commandment? And that's why the rabbis are noticing the usage of the word tazria and saying, if seeding is important, then that's there to tell us something, because the Torah could have just said she got pregnant. Why use that particular language? And the argument that they are making, which again, Rabbi Shimon doesn't fully agree with, but which the majority do, is that the Torah was using that language to teach us about when the sacrifice was required. Now, the rabbis are not putting a value judgment on needing the sacrifice or not needing the sacrifice. They're not saying a child that was born through the birth canal is somehow better than a child that was born through C-section. That's not the way the rabbis do their work. The rabbis are saying, what is the Torah actually saying? And they're not going to obligate somebody to a sacrifice that the Torah has not obligated them to. And they're not going to allow a person to make a sacrifice that the Torah has not obligated them to make.
But
So that's their primary goal. Now, why did the Torah itself choose to use that language? Why did the Torah make a distinction within its own language? Great question. I have never seen a commentary that tries to justify that, because the majority of the commentary on this particular topic is about what does and doesn't count with regards to obligating the sacrifice itself. And it doesn't seem like anybody wants to say there is more importance or less importance attached to the way the child was born. It's just a cesarean does not trigger the sacrifice. A birth canal birth does trigger the sacrifice. And that's the functional, that's the main argument, the functional argument. And not trying to derive a particular agenda regarding birth type, because it's just, well, what did happen and what did the Torah say about these topics in these circumstances?
Rabbi, can you show us exactly the sentence, the part where say Tazria? Because I
Sure.
don't remember where exactly.
Just a
which
second.
word. Yes.
The easiest way to do that is to just pop into Tazria. There we go.
Where?
Okay.
wow.
Right. So we have it right here in verse 2 of chapter 12. Right?
Tazria.
Ki tazria, v'yalda zachar. Now, you'll notice that in the English translation, that's the default here, it blurs the definition of tazria. Let's just see real quick here, because again, I love Safaria because of its flexibility. If we go to some other translations, let's try the 1917. It tends to be a little bit more, if a woman be delivered, again, that's not great. Let's try, Koran is often quite good. If a woman have conceived seed and born a male child, right? That's the probably closest we can get in the English to capturing the at least root words of the Hebrew. Now, those of you who've studied with me before know that a quote literal translation often blurs the meaning, because the literal word in English doesn't always have the same meaning as that word might have in the Hebrew. And the difference between the meaning 3,000 years ago and 2,000 and 1,000 and now could also be different. But because the rabbis actually argue that this usage of the phrase seeding is important, that is why they make that distinction. I think it is helpful to notice that that word occurs in the section here. Now we can get into another long conversation of exactly how this tazria works. It's in the he feel form, and why there is that causative nature to it. But that goes back into more of how the ancients imagined with their limited conception, conception of how childbirth had worked. And they saw the idea of seeds as being something that the man produced and maybe the woman produced, depending upon which person was writing the book. But that's a whole nother conversation. But biblical medical knowledge and the idioms that were used in the Torah to be understandable to the people of its day, which doesn't mean the Torah was trying to tell us exactly what happened biologically. The Torah was simply trying to tell their audience in language they would understand, since they didn't have microscopes, DNA, and all the things we have, what they needed to do in these circumstances. That can sometimes be confusing if we don't bear that in mind. And I'll stop with the childbirth puns. All right, so we're going to leave it there for tonight because we're after 8 o'clock. And there was no way we were going to get into the next Mishnah anyway, because if you thought that's complicated, the next one gets even more. It's a great argument between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. I'm sure we'll get through that next week. And hopefully we'll get to the Mishnah afterwards, which has a really interesting bit of discussion about how much power do the rabbis have to try and redress an inequality in the community. So we'll leave that as a teaser for next week.
Rabbi, I don't know if you saw my text. Let me know after that when you have a few minutes to talk.
Sure. Regarding USY, I did see the text, but I got home, as you saw from my text to the TI, running late
No
after
problem.
school. So
No problem. Just text me when, okay?
will do.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you for a very lively discussion. I really like classes like this.
Intensive discussion.
It's exactly right. I mean, and following all of the different threads, taking us into Pinyon Haben, asking about issues of abortion in the modern world. It's Mishnah is supposed to continue to generate discussions. In fact, they wrote a book about it. They wrote 2 books. Remember, the Talmud, Yerushalmi, and Bavli were both written out of conversations like ours. Not to compare us to the sages of the Talmud, don't get me wrong, but it was that process of asking additional questions and looking for implications that led to the Talmuds being written. So we are carrying on the tradition. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you next time.
Excellent,
Thank you,
Robert.
Rabbi. Yes, sir.